All right, everyone. Welcome to Gateway API meeting for October 3. We've got a few things on the agenda, and as always, feel free to add more as you see fit. Welcome to Kubernetes community meeting. All of them are fairly similar in the sense that anyone should have access to this agenda. Feel free to add things, and everything is subject to the same Kubernetes code of conduct, which is in general just be nice. So with that, I think I'll hand it off to Mike because you've got the first thing on the agenda.
All right. So yeah, this is, I can share my screen if that helps her. But yeah, so wanted to just kind of like recap over the past couple of weeks in the Gateway API for service mesh meetings, which are happening during alternating time slots on Tuesdays following this meeting. We've been kind of workshopping numerous ideas for how to use the HTTP route resource to manage mesh traffic rules, specifically focusing on the producer use case. So as a service owner, I want to configure canary deployments or other ways of splitting traffic intended for a named service. And we've gone through a series of proposals there, and we came up with finally a GEP, which I have opened today, a couple hours ago. We've got 1426 for HTTP route mesh binding, and I'm trying to share this. All right. So this is not approved yet. The PR is open. Please feel free to read it and comment on it. I'm just going to be scrolling through the preview for kind of clarity to go over it at a high level. Yeah, the kind of crux of this is using the HTTP route resource for east-west traffic management. There are a verbose set of goals and non-goals, which really were necessary to kind of narrow down the scope of what is the minimal case that we can capture in a proposal and implement in isolation, and trying to like defer as much as possible for more complex or potentially difficult to implement scope to future proposals. So like that includes egress use cases, consideration of authentication or authorization of services, policy attachment, or outside the cluster resources such as VMs. But kind of the high level goals is to be able to support configuration of these routes by a service owner, having some mechanism to allow cluster operators to allow which services or how routes are applied to the mesh, and being able to have it clearly defined on a route where and how traffic is being redirected, and including support for transparent proxy use cases. So being able to deploy these resources without substantial reconfiguration by application developers. All right. So with that, kind of like the proposed approach that we ended up on is relatively simple. It does not require adding any new APIs. It does not require any breaking changes to the existing API. And it's really just a clarification of defining expected behavior when HTTP route resource is configured in this way. So what we're proposing to do is manage the application of the traffic routing rules to services by, instead of defining a gateway as a parent ref, targeting a service as a parent ref of an HTTP route. Through this, we can then use the backend refs field to just as we would for binding to a gateway, to be able to split traffic between different services, different versions of a service. This can be useful for canary deployments, for redirecting traffic when breaking out a monolith or something like that. And there are verbose details on kind of the nuances of how this should be implemented, of what services are allowed to be referenced in this way or are not allowed to be referenced in this way, specifically like node port and load balancer. They're not specifically excluded elsewhere that I can see in the Gateway API spec, but it just being clear that that is not a preferred way of exposing services publicly. The Gateway API North-South API should be preferred for that case. And similarly with external name, there's an open issue describing how it could potentially be used in Gateway API, but for now, it's left as a should not because of potential security concerns with it. There's coverage of services without selectors, stateful sets, potential option, as well as multi-cluster support for service import, and some of the nuances of how the host names field and graph depth and preventing circular references should be handled. I'll pause there for a moment. Rob, you have a question?
Yeah, I just so just to go back up a bit to the allowed service types. That one stuck out to me a little bit. I think of services, node port and load balancer are basically a superset of cluster IP. In terms of service type, is there a reason we'd intentionally exclude, like if we allow the subset, which is cluster IP, why are we excluding services that just happen to have more than that? Like they still include everything that cluster IP has.
So the intent, and this is one of the few areas where we did not have substantial prior discussion. A lot of this has been workshopped through a substantial amount of prior discussion. This spot was trying to kind of clarify some behavior that is not explicit currently or well-defined within the existing Gateway API spec. The intent was that if you have a need to expose services directly outside the cluster like these ways, it should be preferable to use the North-South Gateway API interfaces. If there's viable use cases for this, where it could reasonably be expected to like not cause conflicts with this or North-South Gateway API behavior, I'm open to suggestions, but kind of the spirit of a lot of the constraints in this gap is to really restrict the proposed implementable functionality to a narrow subset, with the intent that some of these constraints could be relaxed later if there's use cases to justify them.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess kind of a follow-up question here, like, and this, I'll say that I am not a mesh expert here, but my rough idea here is that of this idea is that you would have say a load balancer type service or a node port type service that you've used to expose your application externally, let's say, but that same application you want to for east-west traffic apply some kind of policy or some kind of traffic splitting to. And so I thought the purpose of this API would be, to be able to attach to a pre-existing service and for east-west traffic, apply some kind of policy to it, regardless of what's happening north-south. But maybe that's too big of a distinction there.
So that is explicitly, basically the interoperability or the interaction between north-south and east-west configuration is listed as a non-goal because there's a few different ways we could approach it, and I anticipate that we're going to try to explore that in a future gap. There's a few different ways that could happen. One is by supporting multiple parent refs. I suppose the other service types is another way, even though that's not something that we'd really talked about much as an option. And then there's also like implicit references or like implicit application of mesh rules to north-south routes, which is a thing that is possible in Consul's implementation currently, but may be difficult to implement across vendors or in a standardized way. Bowie, question?
Yeah, I think to follow on what Rob says, is it more accurate to say that this proposal says nothing about if you have node port and load balancer, what that means for the mesh versus you can't? Because I think by restricting it, it feels a little funny just because of the current semantics of how services work.
That's valid. I'm totally fine modifying the language there. I saw Costin suggested in chat should not instead of must not, or being explicit about does not have any implications for this functionality. Costin?
Right, you can still use it. It's just that the cluster IP aspect of it and that behavior is the only thing that's really being specified.
Yeah, I think one of the problems we are seeing, and we discussed at length, is that service is multiplexed, and it means a lot of things. And this is a way to kind of select specific semantics of service. I mean, it's a front end for in-cluster services, and focus on those first, and then leave, egress use cases and ingress use cases to separate discussion. I mean, ingress is already covered by gateway, and it's better to not duplicate it because it will create confusion for users. And for egress, we want to tackle it at some point, but it may or may not use the same solution because initially we found out that egress is very, very different from in-cluster in many ways.
That's a very good summary of it. So thank you for sharing that.
I also have a question on the stateful set, because the stateful set is right now not part of the service concept. Can someone kind of talk about this a little bit?
This was another last minute addition. When I was going through trying to enumerate every possible kind of service in response to some feedback that Nick had about being more explicit about this. I am very open to recommended language or exclusion of this specifically. It seemed like it could be valid is the only reason it's included.
But stateful sets and headless services are particularly tricky to implement from a mesh perspective, and also kind of fit in the category where we want a separate discussion because it's persistent session. It's, how do you deal with multi-cluster? There are a lot of issues with both of them, and they deserve their own discussion, I think.
All right.
The one thing I missed there was multi-cluster. Do you mind going over that one more time?
Sure.
Just right below stateful set.
Yeah, so this is mostly just acknowledging that service import could be referenced in a very similar way to service, and linking out to a specific use case in which one might want to do that. It is a may, it is not a should, it is not expected as part of conformance or anything like that. Just kind of acknowledging the extensibility of this design supports that use case as well.
Okay, makes sense.
And yeah, just there's an extensive list of alternatives that we considered and discussed. Just briefly, one of the primary ones we considered was introducing a new resource to represent the front end role of a service. And among other drawbacks, kind of there's some substantial interest in the problem to be solved is fundamentally an issue with the upstream service resource itself. And the approach that we're proposing of directly referencing a service as a paragraph does not foreclose solving that upstream eventually. And kind of the intent would be to minimize like excess abstraction or API churn in doing so. And one of the other options, which is still relevant, not necessarily on its own, but possibly in combination with the way that we're proposing, is adding a mesh resource as a parent ref. So those two in particular are likely worth reading through just to think about how that functionality may have a bearing on future design decisions, and kind of like how we ended up in the spot that we're at now. Richard, question?
Oh, there we go. Yeah, so I have a question from the perspective of a proxyless service mesh about the hostname section here. And sorry if this section has already been discussed. So it seems that the proposal here is very DNS oriented, right? Like we use the kube DNS name from the service. So I don't know if there are any other proxyless service meshes out there. My comments are going to be from the perspective of gRPC proxyless service mesh. The way that name resolution works is instead of depending on the host header and routing based on that, instead, when you direct your request at some target string, we use that target string directly without performing a DNS query. And instead, we use that to query the control plane and get the configuration directly. So the thing that I can't fully figure out how it would work is like the search path, right? So like ideally, if you're in the same namespace, you should be able to direct a request to pod foo as like foo, right? And not like foo.internal, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
I don't see how you can get around that for proxyless. What you'd end up with is like a degraded UX for proxyless. So one way you could get around it is like you could use the host names field, which is already there within the route, right? But we're saying explicitly that we don't want to use that. Instead, we want to depend on DNS.
So it's less depend on DNS, and I think support a model by which it is possible to not require reconfiguration of DNS. I think, this is me not being super familiar with proxy stuff, so I'm hoping that John or Custom would be able to offer some additional explanation, but I would expect that if it is possible, if you're specifying upstream by any other means, then as long as the control plane is aware of this configuration, it should be able to route that request properly.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, the idea is really that we're just referring to a service as a name. Like in the normal proxy mesh case, we identify that by IP address, which happens to rely on DNS. For proxyless, you could just identify it by the name, right? If they say, you know, send a request to foo and they have a route for the foo service, then you can look that up. It doesn't have to actually do DNS or actually rely on IP addresses. You as the mesh implementer are responsible for defining what it means to attach to a service. Now, if you are a normal proxy mesh, then you should do that based on IP address. I think we're saying that. I think it's reasonable. Like that's just an implementation detail, really. The behavior is the same, right? They called this service, and they get that behavior.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. So as long as the idea is not that like you know, proxyless users would have to have a very long target string with lots of sort of boilerplate.
So a slightly different take on this is what I think that says is that arbitrary host names are not supported. It doesn't mean that foo is not supported, or foo.namespace or foo.namespace.svc. But if you want to put the name google.com or example.com, that will fit into the egress use cases, and it's a different problem than what we are solving. For you know, virtual, for HTTP, we'll still use the host header authority. I mean, the host name will still be used in a lot of places. I mean, for verification, for other things. But it means that we cannot define arbitrary host names through this mechanism, because that's the egress use case.
Right. Okay, that resolves my concerns. Thank you.
Awesome, thanks.
I just had a kind of a broader question on this gap, and that is, it seems like a deferred goal or a non-goal of this is really to define how this interacts with, well, anything else, basically, right? So, it seems like this is really designed in the bubble of let's take these APIs as they exist and make them work for our use case, which makes sense. But it seems like we may, if we're not careful, we may end up on a path where these APIs are used in two different bubbles, in two different worlds, and those never interact. And I think that's not the end goal. I am concerned that if we go too far down this path without defining how east-west and north-south interact, or how multiple meshes interact, that just the gravity of that approach of this is the way we do mesh could be hard to overcome when we try to merge these back together.
I agree. I'll hold it. Costin, you have some comment, and then I'll offer my.
Yeah, I think I don't think we said that they should not interact or should not with anything. We're quite the opposite. I think one of the discussion was that gateway API should respect the semantics of HTTP route attached to a service. And there was a discussion prior in gateway working group about composition or I don't remember how it was called, but how to nest or chain routes. And I think that will need to be revisited in context of this gap. I mean, what does it mean to, if you have a HTTP route attached to a service and then a gateway pointing to that service? That's a composition, and it should be a particular case or should be included in whatever composition the gateway will use.
Yeah,
and
so
others, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so yeah, thank you for bringing out. Like, this definitely intersects with some of the concerns that were raised in the route inclusion and delegation gap. And so I'm currently working on a small gap as a follow-up to this, to really focus on that north-south and east-west use case in terms of what is the integration point between them, because there are at least like 3 different ways that it could be implemented. So I agree that should be one of the next things that we focus on before we kind of get too deep in the weeds on authorization policy and things like that. Keith, you have something? And then I'll go back to
Yeah, I just had a general note here. As far as Gamma and kind of the way we've gone about trying to do things is we've tried to limit scope and focus on, okay, what are some of the more natural semantics that arise from trying to represent mesh semantic within Gateway API. And I think this gap is very representative of that. And I'm thankful to Mike and others who have contributed and gotten it to this point. It's a lot of good work being done here. From some of what I'm hearing Rob and Bowie mention here, I think that something to keep in mind, that I'm keeping in mind moving forward, is how do we address those intersection points between mesh semantics and north-south semantics? Because in this gap, we've kind of tried to defer those conversations. I don't know that we're always going to be able to do that. Bowie had a comment, I think it was Bowie, about we should try to upstream as much stuff as possible. What's the process for that? That's something we should be figuring out. There was at one point, there's some hesitation to a particular approach because it would require changes to the upstream HTTP route resource. And that was one of the attractive things about this approach for HTTP route, is that it wouldn't require any upstream changes. How open is the Gateway API project to changes to those CRDs? What do we try this first and then make sure and see if it breaks down before we consider changing the upstream API? That's kind of territory that we're in here. And yeah, even if the changes are backwards compatible, that does require a certain level of scrutiny, understandably, when you're making changes to already implemented resources that I believe are already in beta. So I don't really have solutions here, but I think these are questions we should be thinking about as we start, really talking about things like HTTP route that are really shared. I think we got to figure out ways to be able to work and to iterate and to experiment, but also, recognize that these APIs are already in use by a lot of people. So I'll get off my soapbox and let anybody respond if they want to.
Yeah, those are good thoughts. I think I speak for myself anyways, that I'm certainly open to gateway API changes for Gamma. I mean, this is a pretty huge use case and we want to make it, see it succeed. The places that I start to get uncomfortable are potential fields that add confusion to the API. Like as an example, if we had a list of service refs in all routes, that I don't even know if that was ever a proposal, but let's just pretend we did. That's something that you could say made sense for north, south, and east, west, and be confusing. Is this just for mesh? Is this just for east, west? So if we do make changes, I would strongly prefer that they not confuse the north-south use case. That's kind of my take on it. We do have an experimental channel that we're all familiar with. So even though this resource has made it to beta, we do have a mechanism of getting experimental fields in it. So I don't want everything in Gamma to feel like it's unnecessarily restricted by we can't possibly make upstream changes, so we'll just work with what we have. Yeah, and then kind of I guess after that follow-up, just a kind of the next question for me is, this is a massive gap. Thank you for writing it. You already mentioned there's a follow-up gap coming. Like what is the point that mesh implementations should feel comfortable to start writing something like implementing, like what is the base set of gaps or approved whatever that we need to make this implementable?
So that is one of my hopes in really trying to constrain this to kind of core functionality and pushing off a lot of the edge cases, is that the basic, like very basic traffic splitting functionality of a service mesh should be implementable with this gap alone. That is my goal for it. And I would love to see it have support, and if it does advance to being approved, that's kind of the intent of this. A lot of the like other stuff that we've talked about is kind of behavior or changes to augment that functionality. So being able to integrate mesh services with gateway API north-south routes, being able to do something like control egress functionality or redirection from arbitrary domain names to in-cluster services, being able to specify consumer-oriented routing overrides that would be narrowly scoped to only like a particular service or a particular namespace and not broadly applicable to any service dialing that. So that kind of functionality is stuff that we think could be like, maybe it ends up in an extended conformance or something like that, or is just ways to add on to kind of like the core use case. But the hope is really that this gap lets meshes start implementing Gamma, is kind of the hope.
Awesome. Okay. And I think this is my last question. If I understand the potential overlap right now, it's that the same route cannot be used for multiple meshes or multiple gateway and mesh at the same time. But you could use the same service and attach, like one route could be used for north-south to forward that to that as a backend ref. And the other route could define how mesh interacts with that same service. Is that accurate?
I believe that is accurate. Where that is defined here somewhere. Yeah, okay. I think it's in the like limiting graph depths rules is where that should be defined. So like the intent of those restrictions is to still allow an HTTP configure mesh traffic rules to additionally specify. So I guess that part's underspecified currently, but like there's an extensibility point there, which is one of the options for how mesh services, HTTP routes could share functionality across north, south, and east, west implementations. But yeah, it's intended to not foreclose having a service targeted by an HTTP route for mesh, and also as a backend ref of an HTTP route for gateway north south. That's a lot of words, but I'm rambling a little, but I think that we share the same intent in the scoping here. And if there are suggested tweaks to these constraints that would better allow that, we are definitely open to that.
Cool, makes sense. I think I'll just do a time check. We've got other things on the agenda, so if there are no other comments, I'll move on to the rest.
Thanks, y'all. Appreciate it.
Cool. Yeah, thank you. Great gap. Excited to see all the detail there already. I just wanted to give a quick update on reference grant. I think many of you may have been following this discussion, but just so you know that reference grant has some interest from other SIGs. Most notably, SIG Storage is proposing use of this in one of their caps for, I think it's cross namespace volume snapshots. Hopefully I got the name correct there, but you can read all about the cap in that link. And so there's been some question about where this should live long term. I think reference grant is a concept that has drawn a lot of interest, and it is not really a networking concept. Like, it works for Gateway API, but obviously I think there's broad interest in pulling this somewhere more neutral. Last week, I brought this back to SIG Auth, which was basically a year since we discussed it last at SIG Auth. Some really good questions, which I kind of outlined here, and are going to require some more follow-ups. But just to highlight, one of the questions, are references assumed to be read-only? We have two very specific use cases we're using reference grant for today, and they are read-only. But there is kind of an open question of what else reference grant could be used for. Got a good question about, do we have anything that formally says what to do when a reference grant is well defined? I think we've had this discussion, but I couldn't find anything in writing. So I think we both need a conformance test for this and documentation. I have a PR, which I'll get to, which gets half of the way there, but we still need some conformance test coverage. Similar questions, do we ever disclose if a resource exists if a reference grant does not first allow the cross namespace reference? Again, we don't want to leak information that a user would not otherwise have access to. There was broad interest, could we make this generic enough that you could just have a library that could implement the logic? I think we're close, but the problem is that there's not a consistent place that the reference comes from. Within Gateway API, we have, in one case, a list of backend refs, and in another case, a list of certificate refs, and they're both kind of nested in objects. It'd be hard to fully automate the implementation of that. And then kind of the last thing that I really wanted to highlight here is, I think Jordan had this idea, is there a way when someone's creating a reference grant to validate that they actually have access to the resource that they are providing access to? Obviously, we are looking at reference grant as a highly privileged resource, but it is still interesting to have some kind of automation in front of that double checks when that grant is created that the user has access to expose that resource. So anyways, just some good follow-ups here. I'll try and create an issue to track conformance test coverage. And if anyone has time, I filed this PR that documents a variety of things that we were missing before. So hopefully this helps fill in some gaps and gets us a little bit closer to beta readiness for reference grant, but just wanted to highlight the otherwise excellent feedback we got from SIG Auth, and I think there's still some interest here in bringing this to a central home, but we have no idea how to do that. No, we as many of us are familiar, kind of treading completely new ground in everything we do. So I'm going to try and bring this up at SIG Arch this week. Anyone is welcome, as always. But how on earth do we, if we move this to, you know, being owned by SIG Auth as an example, or another SIG, and it has a more neutral home, how does that work? Nobody really knows right now. Theoretically, SIG architecture would be able to help us figure that out, but yeah. My proposal is that we continue to towards graduating this resource to beta in Gateway API. I think any of these other tracks are going to take quite a while to get anywhere. So I'd rather just continue in the path that we have. And if we happen to get widespread consensus from SIG Auth and SIG Arch and anyone else that this should move, we can deal with that when we deal with that. Any thoughts, preferences on reference grant? Cool.
Feels like some validation of this being a workable model if other projects are interested in adopting it as well. So
Yeah, I think it's all. Go ahead, Costin.
No, I put a comment. I think it may be worth discussing with whoever owns the RBAC resource if this wouldn't be better, treated as because RBAC is already a high privileged, security related permission, and there is some duplication here.
Yeah, so that's SIG Auth. So that.
Sorry, I misunderstood. I didn't know what SIG is.
Sorry, yeah. In Kubernetes. In Kubernetes, the Auth special interest group owns RBAC and a variety of other things, but they seem most relevant to this. A very clear distinction between reference grant and RBAC is that reference grant is meant to be runtime validation, in the sense that if it's revoked, we expect that access to be revoked, whereas RBAC is more, as long as you are allowed to create it, you are allowed to create it, and it exists forever. I think the revoking is very important for the networking use case, where we want someone to be able to revoke access to a cross namespace backend or secret or whatever it is. But that is a different pattern than RBAC and requires a different means of enforcement.
Yeah, I mean, presumably even with RBAC, it is possible to revoke it. There's nothing in the API itself that is saying that it should not be revoked or resources are not tracked to the user. But I understand, especially since we are going to move into the authorization policies soon. Yeah. It's probably next on the list. That will be even a bigger overlap and issue. And those are also revocable and have very similar concerns with the reference, basically.
Yeah, definitely. And you're right. It is entirely possible to revoke RBAC, but it's anything the user did while they had that access exists forever. And networking is a little bit different in that we can at least prevent future requests being allowed through that path. So yeah, interested in more discussion. Anyone is always welcome to join these meetings. SIG Arch, I forget when SIG Arch is, but it's midweek anyways. If anyone's interested, just ping me after, and we can go from there. Yeah, that's all for a reference grant. Next one is Kubecon. Kubecon is coming up. We have, I think, by my count, 6 talks that are going to be referencing Gateway API, which I think means we're going to have a lot more people looking at our docs, and our docs have a variety of gaps or, missing pieces that could be cleaned up. So I'd encourage you, we're 3 weeks away from KubeCon now. It's coming up really quickly. So if anyone has a few spare cycles, if you can even just spend some time reading through docs, and if you find something confusing, just file an issue. That's kind of step one. File an issue and say, how on earth, that this part is confusing and this is why. Especially if you're a new contributor and less familiar with the API. If you find something confusing, just let us know, because I'm sure you're not the only one that finds some part of our documentation confusing. And if you find something you feel like you can also fix, PRs are welcome as well. But I would love to have our docs in good shape in advance of our 060 release, but also just likely some more people looking at them as part of KubeCon. With that, I think, Candace, you're up next. Backend properties. Does this still work for you, Candace? I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now I can. Yeah.
Okay, great. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Yes, so I just created this PR, although I have been talking to Rob and Nick a bit about this through chat. And this is the implementation of the GEP 1282 backend properties that Nick started some time ago, and that we were hoping to fill in the implementation part of it as time went on. So I noticed that you can actually, I don't know, did I do something wrong? You can bring this up in the more viewable format. If you click on checks and then.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes, that's it. Yeah, no, I can do. That's a good idea. I'll just run down to the deploy preview.
Or I can share my screen if you like.
Oh, yeah, let me do that. 1 second. You should be able to share your screen now.
Okay. Now I've lost my screen. Okay, I've lost it, but just give me a minute. I'll get it back.
No worries. Cool.
Okay, so you can see that all right?
Yeah, do you mind making maximizing or whatever?
Oh, it didn't come up in this one. I'm sorry. I'll have to go back to the. Is that larger? Does that look larger?
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
Wonderful. Sorry about the setup.
No worries.
So the TLDR and the rest of this, except for what I'll show you a bit later, is was written by Nick Young, and mostly what we're trying to do with describing the backend properties is, well, the initial goal was to be able to enable backend TLS or re-encrypt. But the GEP as a whole is basically sort of summarized as describing backend properties, the properties that you need to use post gateway between your gateway and your service or your target in the end. And that would be where re-encrypt would come in to play. So everything that's here already, I don't think I need to go through it now. He's already written it. And if you haven't had a chance to read through this, I'm going to leave that for later, unless people think I should
No, that makes
spend
sense.
some time on that. Okay. And this is a proposal for the API. So there'll be a new object called backend capabilities. And it is, the intention is for this to be a decorator on top of service. And it does point to the service. And then the reason for doing it this way was because we really wanted to, you know, in the best of all worlds, we'd like to be able to change the Kubernetes service, but we'd rather not at this point wait for something like that to happen. So this is going to be sort of a wrapper to that service on its own. Let's see. So backend capabilities is just the backend name, type, and a spec and status. The backend type itself is, you know, whether it's a service or a service import, which was something that Rob reminded me is coming up in the future. Everything is pretty straightforward. I think this kind of format looks familiar to most people. The target reference is a group kind version name. And the only two kinds there are the service and the service import, as I mentioned. Version is there so that you know, it's easy for us to update based on versions, and to really, you know, be expressive about which version of that target reference we're interested in. I did not put namespace in here, and that may come up in the discussion, because I think we are considering that the namespace should be the same as the backend capability should not be able to go across different namespaces in this implementation. Although I guess that might come up as a topic of debate. And so the spec itself is, I think you call this optional unionized struct or something like that. I forget what it's called. But every type that's in here is what we hope to represent as a backend capability in the future. For now, we're mostly focused on re-encrypt. Just a couple of others that came up for consideration were WebSocket and protocol. And then some other examples are listed in the Go doc for other types of backend capabilities. So for each of the backend capabilities that you define in the spec, you'll have one of these as being as representing the specification of the type. So for re-encrypt, this type is just contains the list of basic types that I think for now that we would need to use for re-encrypt for most implementations. I bet that will come up for debate as well. What kind of specific properties are in the re-encrypt type? There's also, just a couple of examples here for WebSocket type and protocol type. And then there's the backend capability status, and that will be this. I didn't really flesh this out too much at this point, but it'll be an array of conditions similar to the status in all of the Gateway API statuses. I have a example capability here. So for a service, private service, that would be defined like this. I would imagine a backend capabilities for TLS re-encrypt using the API that I described to look something like this. And I did put the wrong name here. I'll have to update that. The name there should be this name, private service. But the re-encrypt information is here. And then there's just a note about implementers of TLS re-encrypt would have to check for these backend capabilities that share the same backend name and backend type as the targeted service to discover capabilities spec that they'd need to actually perform the re-encrypt as it moves, as it is delivered to the service. Are there any questions so far?
I see a path in there. What file system is this referring to?
Probably the file system that's mounted for this capability. Or yeah, I don't. This is just an example. This could be changed for sure.
I have a question exactly on this subject. I mean, that was a problem we have with this feature. Let's say you have a service in namespace A, and you define these backend capabilities. Any caller in any namespace is somehow required to encrypt in order to connect to that particular workload, but they will not have access to the secret because each of them will have a different secret, of course, because different file system, different. So how does it work? I mean, how does the key distribution work? How would the client get a key that is allowed? Normally in Istio we use workload identity, which is different for each client, and we don't have those fields. But if you allow, anyway, I'll let you answer.
This could be a reference to a secret as well. It is just a string. Or is it, did I define it as a string? Yeah, I just defined it as a string. So it could be a reference to a secret if you want.
Yeah, I would lean towards that. I think throughout the API, we tend to have object references. So I would lean to object references here, with a secret being one of those things, and you can create secrets from paths or any other object.
This does bring up an interesting question, which is that usually it's like what is the certificate here identifying? Like, let's say it's an identity. Wouldn't it be the client of, not the service itself, but the service is the endpoint? Does my question make sense? Like, if I am, let's say this is like a website, that client cert is not the property of the website. that I'm going to, but the property of me who's accessing, if it's a client cert. So we just need to make sure that we're putting it on the right end of the communication that we're describing.
Sorry, maybe I misspoke when I asked the question earlier. Even if you use secret and secret reference and everything else, the problem is that all clients in all the namespaces from wherever they are calling would need to have access to this object. So either you require that each client has exactly the same secret name, the same name in each namespace, or this is a way for each client to access a single secret, which kind of defeats the purpose of, because if too many people have access to a secret, it's no longer secret. So maybe we should revisit this and either use workload identity, which is or some other concepts where private key of the client is specified or implicit.
Workload identity, is that a specific object that I'm?
So normally it's SPIFFE identity or so some identities that each client has that will be used as client certificate. So if you require client certificates, you need client to have a private key and certificate, which again, in Istio it's the SPIFFE, workload identity, and in many other cases, Spire and many solutions, or something that is provisioned by client to other means, but it cannot be something that is fixed and decided by the provider how you are going to store as a client the private key and what certificates you have.
I guess like even if you don't use workload identity, I'm curious, Candace, for your use cases, whether or not this works for all your use cases. Because what this is saying is that anyone who accesses your service ends up using that client certificate, which seems to be talking about like the end of the community, like the destination versus the source, which seems to be a more natural fit. Like if I'm using a client certificate, the client certificate's actually a property of me originating the connection versus a property of where I'm connecting to.
Right. So I'm getting that we need to actually define what each of these things is, and maybe even add some more fields here. I was worried when I first started this that we were either going to need to make it so specific that some implementations wouldn't be able to use this. And I kind of wanted to make it, less specific than that. But I went this way in listing out some specific fields, but I didn't define them, hoping that that this would cover all the optional fields, like a basic, not
Right.
so safe, but testing kind of implementation.
Yeah, so
I don't
like
know.
one
I don't
thing
want to.
one thing that would be good is if you go in the goals is to map out some topologies. For example, I can see something where you might have two gateways that access the same service, and each gateway wants to use its own, let's say its own identity. But what that really translates to, if you're talking about certificates, is that they actually use their own unique certificates. Like gateway A will have a certificate A that's using to reach out, and gateway B will have a certificate B. And in that case, what does that mean for your configuration? Like, how would you set that up? Or if it's precluded, then we need to kind of understand what that means.
Okay, so a more full example and use cases.
Yeah, because I think like that is actually a valid use case, and I'm looking at this, it may not be possible with this.
Okay, so A and B with different clients, you said, right?
Yeah,
Or with different.
I think a unique client cert per gateway in that specific use case. Yeah. I do want to do a time check here. We are already over time. Thank you so much for presenting this, Candace, and getting this gap together. There is a PR. Anyone can follow up with that discussion on the PR or in Slack, wherever's easiest. And hopefully we can keep this moving. But thanks again, Candace, for getting it started.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Thanks so much. And with that, have a great week, and we'll talk to you next week.
Bye-bye.